بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيتهم الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والسابقون السابقون أولئك المقربون في جنات النعيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Respected mu'mineen and mu'minat, today we are commemorating the life and the death of the beloved wife of the Prophet of Islam, his first source of comfort and support and strength, and one of those who was a pillar of establishing the first family of Islam. The first family of Islam was established by the Prophet and Lady Khadijah. And it was not just the source of a literal progeny that was the cradle in which Islamic knowledge and spirituality flourished and through which it flourishes even until today, but it was also that family that was what nurtured and what watered the plant of Islam for the entire Muslim ummah. And so every Muslim alive today and every Muslim throughout history, and if we want to take the emanations and the benefits of the message of the Prophet beyond the Muslim community, then every human being who has lived since the time of the Prophet is in debt to Lady Khadijah salamullahi alayha. She is the mother of the Prophet's beloved daughter Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. It was in her household where Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, was raised when he was adopted by the Prophet. Then the Prophet and Lady Khadijah were like his parents, who raised him and through whom he acquired that nobility and that character for which he was so well known by friend and foe alike. She was the grandmother of the successors of the Prophet and the Imams, and she was a source of comfort and solace for the Prophet himself. So it is a very noble personality when we speak of Lady Khadijah, and if we can mention just a few of the dimensions through which we can better appreciate what made her so great, what made her so beloved by the Prophet and by Allah Himself, then we will be better Muslims as a result. That is something which is just the first step that we can take in repaying our debt to her. We find in a hadith that the Prophet once came to Lady Khadijah and he said to her that Inna Allaha yuqri'uki salam, that Allah has sent His salutations and His peace and His greetings upon you. This was a favor which was bestowed upon the Prophet's wife Khadijah, and an honor that was given to her, where she was given the greetings of Allah through the intermissary of Jibreel and the Prophet, and guaranteed and shown her place in paradise. And Lady Khadijah responded to that call, and she lived that life of yaqeen, that life of certainty in the truth of Islam and in the truth of the Prophet's call, when there were very few people, men and women, who were able to have that confidence. The majority of people throughout history, and the majority of people in the time of the Prophet, they had a very pragmatic and what we would consider perhaps a reasonable type of approach with regard to Islam. Some of them were sworn enemies of the religion. They opposed it with every fiber of their being. Some, like Lady Khadijah and those who followed in her footsteps, were early acceptors of the religion of Islam. But the majority of people, some who may have been favorably disposed, and some who may have been unfavorably disposed, their perspective was to say that let's see which way things go. If Islam seems like it's going to win, if Islam seems like it's going to overcome, then we will always be able to join it at that time. Why burn our bridges now, before we are sure? And those who are unfavorably disposed, they said that, well, why take a very explicit stance? Let's see if others are able to take care of this religion and eliminate it, and we will keep ourselves safe. In some cases, those who opposed Islam, they were able to turn and realize their mistake quicker than those who were very pragmatic. Because there is an element of hypocrisy, there is an element of self-interest in the sense of only looking at our material interests, when we always stand back and say, let's see how things are going to go. We're not willing to take a risk for what we believe. If we are willing to take that risk, even if we happen to be wrong, at the very least, we have that commitment to follow up what we think and what we say with what we do. And there is a greater hope that as our eyes are opened, as new things come into our knowledge, we might be able to rectify our steps. So the greatest damage that was done to Islam was not by those who took a stance based on what their principles and what their understanding was at the time. It was from those who knew the truth and opposed it in spite of their knowledge, which was a majority of the early enemies of the Prophet in Quraysh. And secondarily, it was those who may have had an inkling that either Islam was the truth or perhaps they had some hesitation, but they weren't willing to make a commitment. The Quran establishes a principle, and we read in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, As-Sabiqun, As-Sabiqun. Those who go forth towards what is right, they have a special rank. We might think that it is pragmatic, and that it is wise, and that it is great strategic thinking to see how things play out. But that is a very material way of looking at life and at life's decisions. The Quran says that is not the case at all. If you don't know the truth, then find out the truth. But once you know what is the truth, once you have an inkling of which decision is right and which decision is wrong, then your virtue is in rushing to accept and to put into practice what is right. There is no virtue in hedging your bets, in hesitating, and in trying to look after your material interests. And so that is something that is essential for us to appreciate if we are to understand the virtue of Lady Khadijah salamullahi alayha and many of the other early Muslims. And that is what I want to talk about today. In order to do so, if we want to appreciate what it was for Islam and what it meant for the Prophet to have people who were willing to take a stand when Islam was vulnerable, when Islam was weak, when it very much seemed to the majority of humanity that this is a short-lived experiment that the Prophet is going to try to accomplish, but it doesn't look like it's going to get anywhere. When there were people who were willing to follow the Prophet at that time, what did it mean for Islam? Then we only have to look at the lives of some of those early Muslims. It was an accusation that was made against the Prophet, and it was an accusation made against many of the previous prophets as well. If you look at what people said to Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, or Prophet Hud, or Prophet Saleh, or many of the other prophets, then one of their first accusations, one of their first arguments against accepting the message of the prophets was that we see that only the weak and the dispossessed and the poor and those at the margins of society, they have accepted you. Well, of course, they have a vested interest in creating instability, in trying to grab what they can out of those who are established and are successful within society. They have failed in their own lives, and so they want to cover up their failure by claiming a right to that which doesn't belong to them. That was an accusation that was used in so many words against many of the previous messengers, and it was used against the messenger of Islam as well. And it was true with Islam, with the followers of Isa alayhi salam, and with the followers of previous prophets. Many of the followers, maybe even the vast majority of the early followers of the Prophet, did come from the margins of society. And that is why when there were people who could not be said to be uneducated, who could not be said to have accepted the religion purely because they were vulnerable and weak and dispossessed, that had a special significance in undoing the propaganda of those who wish to silence the religion altogether. Lady Khadijah and several of the other early Muslims, they were able to fulfill that role. So I want to begin by talking about one or two of the other early companions of the Prophet, what their contributions were, and then we can also appreciate better some of the contributions of the wife of the Prophet. The first person I want to introduce is somebody known as Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As. He was a member of Bani Umayyah. And as we are familiar, Bani Umayyah was one of those clans within Quraysh that was the most antagonistic towards the Prophet. They were, by and large, enemies of Islam. There were some members of Bani Umayyah, however, who did listen to the Prophet. One of them was Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As. He was, of course, a relative of Abu Sufyan, a relative of Uthman ibn Affan, and the other members of Bani Umayyah. A young man whose father, Sa'id ibn al-As, known as Abu Uhayha, was one of the chiefs of Mecca, one of the prominent citizens of Mecca, and a vicious opponent of Islam. Khalid ibn Sa'id, it is said, he once saw in a dream that he was standing at the edge of a fire, and his father was pushing him in, and the Prophet of Islam was trying to pull him back. And when he woke up, he said that this dream could not just have been a coincidence. It could not simply have been something that I ate or something that was causing me unease and made me see a nightmare. I have to find out what this dream is about. And so he asked, and he found out about the Prophet of Islam, and he went to the Prophet. He said, Ya Muhammad, ila ma tad'unana? Oh, Muhammad, what are you calling us to? And the Prophet said, see these idols that you worship, these stones, these pieces of wood that you have carved with your own hands, that neither benefit you nor harm you. not to worship them, but to worship the one God who has created you and has created all of humanity. Now, that was something for a tribal aristocrat which was impossible to accept. They had their own idols. The Quraysh, the most honorable tribe in Mecca, would never worship one of the lowly gods of a lower tribe. Similar to how today, a very prominent person, a wealthy, a very upstanding citizen, might not really feel comfortable to go into a church or a house of worship that belongs to people who he or she considers to be beneath them. In different ways in our own time, we have those same separations of class. It may not be as explicit as it was when people had separate temples and separate gods and separate idols. But that same ignorance, it exists even today. And the Prophet said in his very first answer that, Khalid, I am calling you to say that your God is the same as the God of your slaves, the same as the God of those who serve you. And before that God, you are no better than them, except by your actions and except by your deeds. So you can imagine, for a person living in that society, how revolutionary and how dangerous it must have seemed. But Khalid said, that makes perfect sense. So he came back, and within his family, he accepted Islam. His father found out. And at that time, the persecution of Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As began. His father said to all of his brothers, that if any of you so much as speak to your brother, you will be deprived of any connection to your family. And so Khalid was boycotted by his parents. He was boycotted by the members of his family. His parents told him that we will do everything in our power, using our influence, not just to make sure that you don't have any benefit from our wealth and our inheritance, but to make sure that nobody dares to give you a morsel to eat. And Khalid said that if you won't feed me and you won't let me eat, then I have a Creator and a Lord who will make sure that I will not starve. He lived a difficult life. There are many examples like this of his courage, his upright character. It is said that his father, Abu Uhayha, he became sick. And then once he had regained some consciousness, he began to very publicly make a proclamation that if I am restored to good health, then I will not allow the religion of Muhammad to survive in Mecca. I will make sure that I eliminate it. And once he had begun to make that public statement and repeat it frequently, his son Khalid said that, "Oh Allah, if my father is actually going to carry out his threat, then don't ever give him the life or the strength to be able to do so." And it is said that Allah caused Sa'id ibn al-As, the father of Khalid, to pass away in that illness, and he was never able to carry out his threat. Allah has His own means of strengthening the religion. Now, Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As, he was one of those people who made his migration to Habasha. He lived under the leadership of Ja'far al-Tayyar, and when Ja'far al-Tayyar returned to Medina after the conquest or during the conquest of Khaybar, Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As, he was one of those people who returned to Medina with Ja'far, a son of an aristocrat, a chief of Mecca, somebody who had given up the good life after having known the good life. And now, after having lived in exile, after having lived in deprivation, he comes back to Medina when Khaybar has been conquest. And any of you who are students of Islamic history, you know that the difference between post-Khaybar and pre-Khaybar is, in the words of Aisha, she said that until Khaybar was conquered, we never ate our fill in our evening meals. But after Khaybar, we never went hungry. That was a very big change. That was when all of a sudden people saw that Islam was going to succeed materially and not just spiritually. That is when Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As returned to Medina. Many people, when they saw that, they were very quick to take advantage of the opportunity for material advancement. Just as a note, the prayer that we know of as Salat Ja'far al-Tayyar, the prayer of Ja'far al-Tayyar, which is a 4 rak'at prayer done in 2 prayers of 2 rak'at, and in that 4 cycles, we recite tasbihat arba'a, subhanallahi walhamdulillahi wa la ilaha illallah wallahu akbar, 300 times. That prayer was a gift the Prophet gave to Ja'far al-Tayyar when he returned from Abyssinia. And the story of that gift was that when the Prophet saw Ja'far and his companions, including Khalid, coming back from Abyssinia, this was when Khaybar had been conquered. Muslims who had been living in poverty, in deprivation, in difficulty for years, all of a sudden were going to achieve the greatest booty of war that they had ever seen. And the Prophet didn't want people to think that now they can forget their original commitment to Islam and think that these worldly riches are something that is worth actually giving importance to. And so when the Prophet saw Ja'far, he said to him, Ya Ja'far, ala ahbuk, ala u'tik, should I not give you a gift? Should I not honor you? And people said that, well, now the Prophet is seeing his cousin after so many years of separation. He wants to reestablish him within Medina. He has all of these riches that have come from the territories that have been conquered. Maybe he's going to give him a large estate. Maybe he's going to give him a house. Maybe he's going to give him servants. Maybe he's going to give him gold and silver. And so the Prophet built up the suspense by repeatedly asking Ja'far, should I give you a gift? Should I give you something valuable? And when Ja'far said that, Ya Rasulullah, whatever you wish, I have nothing that I would suggest to you, but whatever you wish to do, the Prophet said that I will give you a gift. And he turned his back on all of those riches. And he said, this is a salat that I am going to teach you, and whoever wants to learn it with you, وَهِيَ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِمَّا طَلَعَتْ عَلَيْهِ الشَّمْسِ. And if you pray this, then it is better for you than anything that the sun might cover when it rises over the earth, the land, and all of the riches that may exist. Khalid was one of those people who internalized that message of the Prophet. He was sent as a tax governor and as an administrator of Yemen by the Prophet in the last year of the Prophet's life. And his brothers were also utilized by the Prophet for their managerial experience because, again, they were from an accomplished family. Aban ibn Sa'id, the brother of Khalid, he was put in charge of, I believe, Bahrain and other territories. And when the Prophet died, all of the brothers of Khalid, they came back to Medina. And by that time, Abu Bakr had now become the accepted governor of the Muslim territories. He said to Khalid that when you were considered to be worthy of governorship by the Prophet, then there is nobody who I would put in a position of authority more worthy of that position than those who were utilized by the Prophet and who were deemed worthy by the Prophet. And Khalid replied on behalf of all of his brothers that نحن بني أبي أحيها لا نعمل لأحد بعد رسول الله. We will not work for anybody after the Messenger of God. Governorship of Bahrain, it might be a rich territory. The rulership of Yemen, it may be a rich territory. But we did not accept Islam in order to acquire personal benefit or in order to acquire our own material interests. And then Khalid was one of those people who locked himself in the house of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam and said, I know from what I have heard from the Prophet and what I've seen of your character that there is nobody worthy of being followed more than you. And so unless you do bay'ah or unless you tell us to make our peace, we will not make our peace, and we are willing to go back to that life of poverty and that life of hardship again in Islam, just as we were when we first accepted Islam. So one of those people who was an early follower and a courageous warrior ready to sacrifice for the truth of the message of Imam Ali was a member of Bani Umayyah, but one of the earliest Muslims. So Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As is one of those people whom we as Muslims should honor for the sincerity with which he accepted Islam and the sincerity with which he remained a Muslim. Another personality is Mus'ab ibn Umair. He was also not from as prestigious a clan. He was from Banu Abdiddar, descendant of Qusay, so a descendant of the great-grandfather of the Prophet, but he was from a very wealthy family. And his parents, his mother and his father, they raised their kids with a great deal of honor and respect. The Prophet said that Mus'ab ibn Umair was the best-dressed youth in the entire city of Mecca. He was the one who, when he would leave his house, he had the best perfume, the best fragrance, the best clothing, the best atmosphere about him, greatest dignity. And when he became a Muslim, he also was boycotted by his parents. But it was a more difficult challenge that he faced. Different companions of the prophets, they mentioned some of the suffering that Mus'ab ibn Umair, he suffered. Imam Ali alayhi salam used to frequently mention it, and other companions, they mentioned it as well. It is said that he was dealt with so roughly by his own parents who used to honor him so much, that the companions said that we used to look at his skin, and we would think that it was the skin not of a human being, but of a snake that used to shed because he had no shelter. He had such a difficult life, and whatever little he had, he would give it to others, that his body and his person suffered in a way that he was almost unrecognizable. The Prophet, when he used to remember Mus'ab ibn Umair, he used to shed tears and say that I remember what his youth was like, and I remember what he willingly gave up through no compulsion in order to accept my religion and follow me. Mus'ab also made a hijrah to Abyssinia, but he returned early. He couldn't bear that separation from the Prophet, and he was one of the first people the Prophet sent to the Ansar to teach them about Islam. And of course, when there was a teacher like Mus'ab ibn Umair, who himself lived Islam and practiced that religion, the Ansar were very quick in accepting Islam, and he was responsible for several of the tribes of Ansar and their chieftains in accepting Islam. So these are two people who we can see came from a prominent background, a wealthy background, and yet they were able to accept Islam even before many of those weak and vulnerable people who had a material interest in accepting Islam. And the connection that I want to draw with Lady Khadijah salamullahi alayha, and the lesson that I think it is important for each and every one of us to remember in our own lives, is that it is not a matter of superficial wealth, of resources, of background, that is going to be a predictor of whether we are able to accept the truth and whether we are able to sacrifice for the truth or not. Numerically, and in terms of quantity, that might seem to be a good predictor. But one thing that we see in the life of Mus'ab ibn Umair, one thing that we see in the life of Khalid ibn Sa'id ibn al-As, one thing that we see in the life of Lady Khadijah, is that even when they were at the top of society in terms of their honor, in terms of their wealth, in terms of their prestige, they did not consider themselves to be the members of an aristocratic class. They did not consider themselves to be better than other people. They were always servants of noble character, nobility, and they were always searching for the truth. And so when the Prophet confronted Khalid and said that you have to give up those gods that put you in a position of special honor and serve a God who is going to make you equal to every other human being, man or woman, slave or free, Khalid said yes. When Mus'ab was offered that choice, he said yes. Lady Khadijah salamullahi alayha, she was known on the one hand as Malikatu Quraysh, the queen of Quraysh. But she was at the same time known as Ummul Masakin, the mother of the poor and those who were weak and vulnerable. She was the queen of Quraysh. She was the one whom everybody wanted to be associated with. Hers was the caravan that everybody wanted to invest in and wanted to participate in and wanted to work for. But she was the one who would say that all of that aside, my loyalties, my concern, my interest is in looking after the needy members of society, Ummul Masakin, because her heart was closer to those Masakin who didn't share her background, who didn't share her wealth, but who shared her humanity and whom she was able to benefit. That is who she was even before Islam. And that is why she was able to fulfill that role after Islam. So Lady Khadijah, she reminds us, along with those other early Muslims who shared in her sincerity, that if we want to honor the message of the Prophet of Islam, we have to remove ourselves from those prejudices, from those dimensions of our identity and our pride that separate us from the rest of humanity, that we use as a crutch to think that we are better, that we are somehow different, because it is those factors that will encourage us to look after our own interests and our own well-being. Lady Khadijah salamullahi alayha was one of the wealthiest citizens of Mecca on the eve of Islam. But if you want to look at the early history of Islam, it isn't enough for us to say that it was a history of poverty and persecution, even though it was a history of poverty and persecution for the majority of Muslims. It was also the history of Lady Khadijah saying that here are my resources and here is my wealth, and I want to use them to provide the first capital through which Islam can find strength and through which Islam can spread. And she gave all she had in what for all practical and material intents and purposes would seem to be a very unwise investment. There was no return that anybody could predict. Nobody could say that there would be fadak in the future that might compensate for all of the sacrifices that Lady Khadijah made. And fadak also was not ever going to be given to those who were the true heirs of the Prophet's property and his religion and his spirituality. But Lady Khadijah, she made those sacrifices willingly. She gave those things because she was able to see that she was building a future for herself. And she was establishing a principle by which her family would continue to honor the heritage of Islam even after she left this world. And so, as those years of the Prophet's mission in Mecca continued to pass, and hardship became more and more severe. In the first place, there was the capital that began to decline. There were the boycotts that were made by the citizens of Mecca, by even those who until yesterday would try to find some means of getting an audience with Lady Khadijah. Now they would prevent their women and their daughters from even replying to the salam of Lady Khadijah. When Lady Fatima was born, it was custom for neighbors and for relatives to come and for the women folk to give assistance to a lady who was going to go into childbirth in order to assist her in taking care of her affairs. There were no hospitals. It was the relatives and the neighbors who would fulfill that role. But when Lady Khadijah was preparing for childbirth, and when it was the time for Lady Fatima to enter into this world, there was a boycott, and there was nobody who was permitted or who was willing to actually come and provide her that assistance. She bore that hardship, she bore that difficulty, and all of those challenges voluntarily, because she was not a member of Bani Hashim. If she had wished, she would have been able to say to the Prophet that I will remain a supporter of Islam, I will remain a Muslim, but I will not announce my Islam. She went into exile in Syed Abi Talib willingly, and she suffered all that was suffered by those who had no source of support, who had no resources, in the most difficult and the most trying of circumstances. And that is something that we need to remember and remind ourselves of, because even if we are not called upon in our time to sacrifice in that way, if we want to truly honor Lady Khadijah, and if we truly want to say that we follow in her footsteps and we honor the trail that she illuminated for us, we have to be willing to make those type of sacrifices if and when we are called upon to do so. In the final moments of the life of Lady Khadijah, we see that she and the Prophet were left very much alone. The Prophet had not yet come to a point where he was unable to reside in Mecca. But it was not long from when the Prophet would find that Mecca was not a safe place. And Lady Khadijah, being an old and an experienced and a very well-grounded lady, she could see what the future held. When Abu Talib ﷺ was also becoming weak and reaching the end of his age, when she was becoming weak, and as the environment in Mecca was becoming more and more antagonistic towards the Prophet. As her own life began to leave and began to ebb, and as her own strength began to leave her body, her concern was not with her own suffering. But she would turn to the Prophet time and time again and say, "O Messenger of Allah, how is it that you will be able to continue to teach the message of Islam when your source of worldly support and strength will be no longer? I know that Allah will take care of you, but it pains my heart to imagine that I will not be there to be able to share your burden." And perhaps she looked at her young daughter Fatima Zahra salamullahi alayha, who was at that time, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, a very young girl. But she might have said to her daughter that, "Oh my beloved Fatima, I know that you are very young. I know that you are not yet fully grown. But your mother can see that her life is coming to an end. And in spite of your young age, I don't think that there is anybody that I can make a will to who could provide a source of strength and could provide comfort for the Prophet better than you." Whatever words were exchanged between Lady Khadijah and Lady Fatima in those final moments and in those final days and weeks of the life of Lady Khadijah, we can see how wonderfully Fatima Zahra was able to fulfill that role. The Prophet would ever afterwards speak of his daughter as Abiha, the one who was like a mother to her own father when he would come out from Mecca wounded after having been attacked with stones and with sticks and with every type of insult and with words and assaulted in every way. Lady Fatima would stand where her mother stood and lovingly clean those wounds and provide strength and provide support to the Prophet. And the Prophet would look at his daughter and he would perhaps wonder how it was possible for one so young to have such strength. But then he would remember that, of course, this was a daughter who had been trained and had been raised by Lady Khadijah herself. When Lady Khadijah was on her deathbed, it is said that she said to the Prophet that her only concern was for the safety of the Prophet and for someone to be able to look after the well-being of Lady Fatima. The Prophet assured her of Allah's continued favor for Ahlul Bayt, and that he would be both a mother and a father for Lady Fatima. Lady Fatima was at that time old enough to be able to appreciate what was going on. And if we can only imagine just a few short years in the future when Lady Fatima herself was on her deathbed and she had young children by her side, all of those preparations that Lady Fatima made when she put on new clothes for her young children. She said to Ayman, "Bring me my children and bring me some water. I want to be able to bathe each of them and then put on these new clothes and then perfume their hair and comb their hair and give them a loving memory." It was because she remembered how helpless and how vulnerable and how sad her own mother was when she was on her deathbed, that she was not able to do these things for Lady Fatima. Lady Fatima, she prepared her children to be separated from their mother as much as is humanly possible. But how is it possible for anyone to be ready to part from their mother in a young and a vulnerable age? But if we compare those two separations, Lady Khadijah passed away among a city that was ruled and that was governed by polytheists and sworn enemies of the Prophet. Lady Fatima passed away in a city that proclaimed to be followers of the Prophet. But see which parting was more painful, which parting was more tragic. Lady Khadijah was allowed to pass in peace. The Prophet was able to go to Hujun and bury Lady Khadijah publicly and with full honor in the company and in that same graveyard where Abdul Muttalib and Abu Talib were to be buried. There was no need among those mushrikeen to bury Lady Khadijah at night in secret. There was no need to dig tens of graves because somebody would say that we will dig up the grave and not allow Lady Khadijah to be buried. Lady Khadijah was able to be given honors by the Prophet. He was not prevented from declaring the following year to be Amul Huzn, the year of mourning. And the Prophet mourned Lady Khadijah, and he mourned Abu Talib publicly and openly in Mecca. And those polytheists, they did not threaten the Prophet for that mourning. They did not dishonor the funeral or the body or the descendants or the grave of Lady Khadijah. But Lady Fatima salamullahi alayha, when she was parting with her children, she knew that this was not a city of polytheists who might be able to be entrusted with honoring the daughter of the Prophet. This was a city that claimed to be a city of Muslims. She had to give that wasiyah to Amir al-Mu'mineen that, oh my beloved Abul Hasan, I have bid farewell to my children, and now I have certain bequests that I need to make of you. Oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, I know that after I leave this world, you will be surrounded. I know that they will put a rope around your neck, and they will drag you from your house to the masjid, and they will not permit you to be able to mourn my loss, as they did not permit me to mourn the loss of the Prophet. Oh Abul Hasan, I can see even now how my children and how you will be oppressed. And so in preparation for what you will suffer and what my children will suffer, I request you to ensure that my funeral be done at night, and those who are my enemies and those who are enemies of my Ahlul Bayt, and those who will cause them pain, and those who will cause them suffering, and eventually who will be the cause of their blood being shed, they should not be able to participate in my funeral, and they should not know where my grave lies. O Abul Hasan, when you bury me, then bury me in one place, but then dig other graves, because I do not want the daughter of the Prophet to be the first Muslim whose grave will be dug up and will be dishonored in the history of Arabia. Amir al-Mu'mineen knew that those threats actually existed. He said to Lady Fatima that he would carry out what wasiyah she had made to him. But imagine what it must have been like for Amir al-Mu'mineen to bid farewell to the daughter of the Prophet, knowing what a heavy burden of grief she bore on her heart. Suffice it just to remember one incident that took place after Lady Fatima had left this world, and Amir al-Mu'mineen was making the preparations for her ghusl and for her kafan and for her dafn. It is said that when Amir al-Mu'mineen was washing the body of Lady Fatima, he did so throughout, weeping silently and under his breath. But during the washing of that body, there was one moment when even Amir al-Mu'mineen, who was the very picture of discipline and self-control, could not hold his own voice sacrifice back. And he called out and he wept aloud and was unable to control his tears. Later he was asked, why is it, O Amir al-Mu'mineen, that in spite of the fact that you had been weeping continuously from when Lady Fatima died until that moment, all of a sudden you yelled out in grief? And he said that I never knew for however many weeks I lived after the Prophet's death with my wife how severely she had been wounded in the attack that she suffered when her own door was kicked down and her safety was threatened. This was the dignity and the honor of the heir of Lady Khadijah, Fatima Zahra. This was what she had learned from her mother. Whatever physical and whatever other suffering she had, she was only a source of support and comfort for Amir al-Mu'mineen, just as Lady Khadijah was a source of comfort and support for the Prophet. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow all of us to be able to honor that heritage that has been bequeathed to us by these noble Muslims. May Allah allow us to also identify ourselves not as member of a tribe, not as member of an economic class or a social class or an ethnic group or any of these other superficial groups that divide us, but to be like Lady Khadijah and like those early Muslims who have our loyalties with our religion and through our religion with all of the creatures and all of the creation of Allah. May Allah allow us to always be ready to sacrifice anything that He has given us for His sake. And may Allah never try us in our religion with a test that we are unable to fulfill. May Allah give us the life of Lady Khadijah and her descendants, Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam, and may Allah reunite us with all of them after our death and in the hereafter for all eternity. Let us once again remember all of our marhumeen and all Muslims who have lost their lives and are no longer amongst us by reciting Surah Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladhina an'amta 'alayhim ghayril maghdubi 'alayhim.